Hey guys, Rook Endgames are the most common ones in chess. That's why we need to study and understand them very well. They just happen more often than other endgames. Today we learn how to win Rook and 4 versus Rook and 3 pawns on the same side of the board. Keep watching. The first thing we need to say is that this endgame should actually be a draw if the weak side defends very accurately. Then we need, of course, a very healthy pawn structure without many weaknesses, but also that we need to know the right plan, and then we need to have time to play it on the board when they transpose to the endgame. So the right plan in these positions for the defensive side will be to play the move h5. This is going to be very important because the plan for white to make progress here is to create a passed pawn. The free pawn is on the e file, so they will need to play the move e6 at some point. In general, that's the plan to create the passed pawn and win for white. So if they want to play e6 and create a passed pawn, they will need to recapture with an f pawn over here. But if you want to play f5, you will also need a pawn on g4 to be able to recapture with a pawn there. And if black can actually play the move h5, white will need to play h3 to be able to play g4 and recapture with a pawn, to be able to play f5 later and recapture with a pawn, so they can finally play e6. But in general, every time the strong side trades pawns, we are walking towards a draw. So that's the idea. Black needs to play h5 to make sure at the moment white is creating the passed pawn, they will have traded all the pawns, or maybe many of the pawns they have at that point. So if you're playing with the weak side in an endgame like this, you try to put the pawns like this, and in general you will have very good possibilities to get a draw if you can do that. That being said, let's analyze some examples where the weak side didn't have time, or for some reason didn't play the good defensive side, and let's see what happened in these examples. This is a position by Gligoric as white and the world champion Yue as black. Let's see what happened. As you can see, black couldn't play the typical defensive plan h5, so white is pushing a little here and they're trying to create some problems. In this game, Gligoric is going to play the move g5, which is very interesting. He's losing a pawn here on h5, but he's disconnecting the pawns, and then this one is going to be very weak, and also this one will be isolated pawns. If black doesn't take, there are some threats, for example like h6, forcing the king to go over here, then some check, and then he's getting pawns over the h5, and he's going to be winning. So the game continues here with g takes h5, and then rook a6. The rook goes to b3, and then rook a6, putting some pressure, trying to get the pawn on the h5. Rook a3, king g3. He's not rushing to capture the pawn on h5, since after rook takes pawn, black can play king g6, attacking rook, attacking pawn on g5, and this is just going to be good for black. So he just continues in the next moves, improving the pieces, not taking the pawn by now, because it was not actually very clear. So they have some repetition over there, but in the end, after many maneuvers, Gligoric managed to capture that pawn on the h file, and when that happened, then we transposed to the endgame rook and 3 versus rook and 2, which apparently should be better for black to get a draw, but when we analyze the pawn structure now, this is different. Now there are isolated pawns, and that's a problem, and that's an extra advantage for white in this kind of situations. Let's see how this continued. Rook g4 and then rook f6, protecting the pawn. There, king g7, king a3, rook u1, and then king h4. Of course, we need to play with the king in these positions. And then some checks, the king goes to f5. After rook f1, the rook comes to c6. Very often the plan in these positions is to put the rook on the 7th rank and try to put pressure with the advance. So king to f8, rook c8 check, king to g7, and then rook to d8. Rook f2, rook d1, rook f3, and then king e4. The rook goes to the f2 square, and then white is playing king e3 here, attacking the rook, rook a2, and this is the moment. Now white is playing f5 here. Black plays rook to g2, and then this special move, rook d7. The idea we were saying some time ago, pinning and putting pressure, threatening e6. Black takes the pawn on g5, but now king f4 first, and after rook g1, white is playing here e6, getting the pawn there on f7, and there will be a passed pawn on the 6th rank, actually two connected passed pawns after that capture. Rook f1, king e5, rook u1 check, and then king d6, h5. White is covering from the checks behind his own pieces, so the check does not make much sense now. So h5, rook takes f7 now, the king comes to g8, the king comes to e7. In this position, Yu is going to resign. He's completely lost because these pawns are too advanced and they're just going to promote. But some way to play, for example, after h4, he could play f6, and white is threatening rook g7 check, so black could try rook g1, but then, well, rook f8 and h7. The threat is rook h8 and promotion, just to say one line here. Also, other threats are just moving the rook and promoting. So this position is absolutely winning for white. The next position was played by Capablanca as black versus Duras, and this position is interesting because white is not going to have time to play the defensive plan g3 and h4, so the defense will be way more complicated when they cannot do that. Let's see how Capablanca managed the endgame. He played h5, notice the rook is on h4, controlling very well, avoiding the advance of the pawn. g3 planning h4 in the next, but of course Capablanca is a master, he won't let you advance the pawn to h4. He plays h4 here. There's a trade, rook takes h4, and one more time we have rook on 3 versus rook on 2 here, but we have a plus, and it is the two white pawns are isolated. That's a problem for white. They will have to be always protecting those pawns because they are very weak. The then continues with king g2, e5, king g3, rook d4, and rook a5. Now he's going to create a chain of pawns. They are very well protecting each other. And also in the next moves he's going to improve the position of the king. He's going to make some progress over there. So let's see what happened. We have some moves and the king goes over there, as we were saying. But now he's going to try to make some progress with the pawn. He's going to try to advance a little more. Slowly, but always safe with the pawns. So this continues like this. There are some moves, but finally he can get what he wanted. In the end we have more or less the same position, but the pawns and the king one rank ahead. White continued rook b5, king f4, and rook a5 and rook d2. Again we have the ideas over the 7th rank and the threats by advancing the pawn to e3. I think there is like a repetition over here, like rook a4, king g5, king u1, king f4. They are maneuvering a little. King g2, but then Capablanca starts pushing the pawn. g5. White plays rook b4, king comes to e5. Very often this rook over here is going to help us to block the checks. And I think that is going to happen in the next moves. Rook b5, rook d5, rook b8, and then f4, making some progress with the pawns. Rook comes to g8. We defend the pawn by playing rook d4. The king comes to f1, and black makes progress, moving the king to d3. Rook a8, wanting to use the lateral checks, but then e3. There is a check, which is probably a mistake in this position, because now Capablanca is going to play king e4, and after the capture on e3, he's not just going to recapture as probably expected. He's going to play here f3. The problem with f takes e3 is that white could have some good defensive ideas by moving the rook backwards. So black is just playing f3 here, which is clearly better. This pawn is there, but Capablanca is going to take it very soon. He can create a bridge with the rook, interfere the rook, and capture that pawn on e3. So the game continues here, king u1. King f2 doesn't change too much because black can just give a check by playing rook d2 at any time, so it's not going to be a problem. So king g1 is the move white is playing here, and then, as we said, the bridge. Rook d3, then rook a8, and king takes pawn, rook check, and king goes to f4. Now there are threats with king going to g3. That's why white is playing rook g8, wanting to recapture on g5 if the king goes there. There is a check here, and king f2, rook check, and king f1. Then remember we said this pawn was isolated, and that was a problem. Well, now it's going to be very clear why we said that. Black is playing here rook h2, and after king here, rook takes pawn is just winning the game, because now we have two connected passed pawns, and this is just winning in a rook endgame. Duras played rook g7, then g4, rook g8, and then king g3, and this is just winning the game. Black is playing here f2 check, so white resigned in this position. Just to show you a line, if white tried something like rook here, there are many ways to win, but this one is very simple. Black can just play f2 check, and this is just simplifying the position, transposing to king and pawn versus king, where black is winning very easily with the pawn. In the next example, I want to show you how all this theory about the endgame rook and 4 versus rook and 3 on the same side of the board helped me to actually win one of my games in a tournament. Here I was playing as black. It was 2013. I was facing another FIDE master, and in this position, as you can see, white has a passed pawn, very dangerous here on the 6th rank, but also white king is in danger. I have many ideas over here. I have many threats. So let's see what happened. I played queen b1 here, threatening checkmate, and the only way to stop the threats is by playing queen check and queen check. But now I can trade queens, and now we are in a rook endgame. But this is 4 versus 4, but white pawn here is very weak, so probably I can get it. Let's see how this continues. I cannot play rook c1 directly, because then white is getting one pawn here, and then I'm not going to win. This is going to be a draw. So black can play here king g6 first, attacking the rook, making sure my pawn on h4 is going to be safe. And once the rook goes back to f2, now I can play rook c1, getting the pawn on c6. After this, white is playing rook a2. I take the pawn on c6, and this is the endgame we are studying in this video. This is rook and 4 versus rook and 3, but something very good for me. White pawns are not connected, they have an isolated pawn here on e3. Also, my pawn is on h4, it's creating, controlling some squares over there. This could help at some point during the rest of the endgame. White is playing here king g1, I played e4 here, and king f2, king g5, making some progress. g3, f5, advancing the pawns slowly, but they are always safe and protected. And white is playing king g2, and then rook c3, attacking the weakness, slaving white pieces to the defense. He takes h4, king takes h4, something interesting. Now there is another isolated pawn on a3. This is going to be a problem later in this game. Rook e2, g6, connected and safe pawns there. King goes to h2, and now there is a very special plan I found during this game, and it is the idea of putting the rook over here over f3. If I can do that, I will be attacking both pawns at the same time, and this is going to be winning the game for black, and that's what I tried to do. Rook d3 first, just to make sure I have the right time. White plays here king g2, and now rook d1. White is like in Suksuan, this rook has to protect here and this king has to protect here, so they can just move the king to one side and the other. The king comes to h2, and now rook f1. At this point, white resigned. The problem is that I'm playing rook f3 in the next move. As I was saying, if there is a move like rook g2 trying to get one pawn, we don't have to rush. Black can just play g5, protecting our pawn, and we keep the same threat of rook f3. Summing up, in the endgame rook and 4 versus rook and 3, there are good possibilities to win. Typical and strong plans in these positions are activate your king and your rook, try to create a passed pawn, do not trade many pawns, and also try to create weaknesses in your opponent's pawn structure. The question for today: which of the three examples did you like the most? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you on the next.